I didn't break the planet. It was this way when I found it, all right?
Everybody laughed when I first said I wanted to be a comedian. Well, they're not laughing now, are they?
You know why it's nominated, don't you? To catch the tears of joy.
It's a Celtic phoenix. People are thankfully being stupid again.
Welcome to Gurus of Comedy.
With your host, Dave Keeshan.
Welcome to Gurus of Comedy. I'm your host, Dave Keeshan. Today we have on the line from Hertfordshire, I got that one correct, apparently,
Sorry.
Simon Cockle and Sam Harriot, who are two podcasters and media teachers, you said, based over there.
Yep. Lovely to be here, Dave. Thank you.
This is my first three-way podcast, so I'll have to figure out a way of like, Sam, go! You know, now Simon. So, what you guys have a podcast of your own? What's it about?
It started out quite specific, and we've just become so broad, vague, and irrelevant. We will do any old topic, any old week, and any old accent to discuss it. So, it's something for everyone.
It came about because when the lockdown started, I'd been doing a poetry podcast because I'm a poet as well as a podcaster, and basically couldn't do it anymore because we weren't allowed to meet up. So I just put out something on Facebook saying, would anybody be interested in doing a podcast? And I'd known Sam from when we used to teach with each other, and he was a friend on Facebook, and he said, yeah, I'd be up for doing it. So, you know, we kind of talked on Messenger about what we'd want to do, and just decided to go ahead and record it. And we record it remotely, so we use Podbean, so we don't actually have to be in the same postcode to do it. And yeah, we started off, didn't we, Sam, with the idea of the sacred cow, because that's the name of our podcast, as in we would take a sacred cow every week and we would kind of shoot it down in flames for comedy purposes. And then after about 3 or 4 episodes, we just couldn't be bothered to do that anymore. So we just decided to keep the name, but each week we take a topic and we just do stupid stuff that makes us laugh, really, for an hour, and then do another topic the next week. So
that means that I didn't realize that means our topic today actually kind of is quite close to the name of the podcast, the Sacred Cow.
Yeah, definitely.
We have decided to talk about what I refer to as media offense or censorship. So this is done in the background with, there's a French movie that went on release in the US recently called Cuties, which covers, they say, sexualization of young girls. Which I haven't seen the movie. I don't know if it's good or bad. Maybe it does or it doesn't. And it's slightly irrelevant because there's people in the US who want to see it banned, but they haven't seen it. So this is kind of cancel culture for topics that they don't know anything about. They've just read something. And this brought me to mind of the famous Brass Eye episode back in the late 90s, I think it was 97, where the pedophile episode, where it's ostensibly not even about pedophilia, it's about the media coverage of pedophilia. There was such an uproar in the UK that there was members of parliament standing up saying, oh, this is absolutely terrible. I haven't seen it myself, but I think it should be banned.
Last month, the notorious paedophile Sidney Cook was blasted into space to spend the rest of his life aboard a one-man prison vessel, posing no further threat to children on Earth. But it was revealed that an 8-year-old boy was also placed on board by mistake and is now trapped alone in space with the monster. A spokesman said, "This is the one thing we didn't want to happen."
So that's kind of the world we're in right now. And yeah, what's your take on that and where and the stuff that's been there before?
Simon, do you want to start on this one? Because I know you're a big, you're like a Brass Eye, Blue Jam, Morris kind of fan, aren't you?
Well, if we start with the Cuties film, because I didn't really know very much about it until the Twitter storm occurred, and I discovered that cancel Netflix was trending, and that disappointed me because I really like Netflix. But I did a bit of finding out, and it's a film by Maimouna Dakouré, who's a filmmaker, and she took the story, an autobiographical story of her experiences, and the film explores the tension between her kind of Muslim upbringing and the kind of Western values that she encountered. And I haven't seen the film, and I didn't see any of the Netflix coverage of it. But I'm conscious of the fact that Netflix looked at the film and did something with it which wasn't really in the spirit of the film. So it's a common thing to take an obscure independent film and try to find a way to sell it to a more westernized audience. So, like the film The Human Centipede. Not The Human Caterpillar. That's the other film. But The Human Centipede was another one, another kind of relatively obscure film that they repackaged in order to try to sell it. And I think the issue is the way Netflix have tried to resell it. And they have apologized and they've realized that it was inappropriate. But what's fascinating is the tale of outrage that appears. And of course, on the outside, you've got people that have never seen the film, didn't see the Netflix coverage, who become outraged just at the thought of what the film is about. You've got people who are outraged because they don't like Netflix or they don't like independent movies. And then at the heart of it, you've got people who are outraged because, it triggers something within them, whether they've been in that situation themselves. And I find it fascinating because I think at the heart of all of this outrage, there are people who have a genuine issue and find it genuinely uncomfortable and genuinely offensive. And I think what comes first is that emotional response, and then after it, what should come is some finding out, some research, some looking at the evidence, and then weighing it up. But of course, in the culture that we live in now, the sort of 15-second, scrolling through things and seeing something appear in your timeline.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. Like, I always find that, you're absolutely right that it is obviously touching a nerve that some people have experienced in their life. But I also find that, some people have been, or family members have been, had murdered through violent means, and we have movies and movies and movies of that every day. But that's considered normal, that like there's a certain type of violence that we think's okay. And particularly in America, I always find like the dichotomy of they can be so normal with, like the NCIS where they're doing like some camera basically going through the bullet hole out the back of a head that's been blown off, and they're perfectly fine with that. But then you have the Nipplegate where Janet Jackson kind of exposed her breast on TV, and there's an absolute uproar. And I say, surely one is not the other. And if you wanted to be banning one, I would go for the reverse of the two.
I mean, just to weigh in on this, I would certainly feel more comfortable with a nipple rather than a bullet going through me.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Well, I think everyone should
going through you.
Yeah, the outside of the body is more offensive than the inside of the body.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre. And then, of course, you've got this further thing where YouTube is just its own entity. You can put anything on YouTube now, and advertisers can condemn it, the commenters can condemn it, but it's still out there and accessible for anyone that sets up an account. There's no watershed. Like a few weeks ago, I was watching a Vice documentary about the body farm in America, and it had pictures of actual bodies that the FBI, the American police, use for like tracking how decomposition works in different circumstances. And it's bizarre that that's accessible for anyone up to the age of 18 that has a YouTube account and says they're 18 on it.
But then do you have like the weird setup? Like, so I would see a lot of like the American shows like The Daily Show, less so now that Jon Stewart's left, but more John Oliver. But John Oliver's had a few cases where, while discussing the situation in Britain and Brexit, he's shown videos of coverage from inside the House of Parliament. But apparently that's not allowed to be broadcast in the UK, because any kind of coverage from the House of Parliament is banned if it's in a comedic or satiric content. And they've actually had to cut a separate version of the show for the UK than the rest of the world has seen. And now I imagine, based on the internet, it is possible for someone in the UK to access that content if they want. But it's kind of this weird rule that they still have to do it.
It's similar to the court cases and filming court cases, because as far as I'm aware, we can't film in the UK, but in the US they can have like televised court cases. Is that right? Or
I believe so, yeah.
I just find that so bizarre that, I mean, just because you're in a different country, other people can, whether it's for entertainment or, they, I don't know, I don't really understand what the draw would be in watching a normal court case. I know for like celebrity court cases and things, but I just find it bizarre that something so real, like someone's life being thrown away in some circumstances, and then someone's life being condemned to spending the rest of that time in a cell, and then that can just bring people entertainment. I mean, that's dystopian.
But I've even found like it's maybe even reduced back. So I lived in Sydney, and one of the big shows that was on there, it was Border Security. So they've kind of sold it around the world, so you might have seen it. But if you ever watch that show, some of these people get stopped for bringing stuff into the country that they're not supposed to, and get deported for it. And and at the end of it says, they were put in a cell and were deported from the country 24 hours later. And you kind of go, that's weird. Like, I don't think I'd want that bit, if that were to happen to me, if I'd want that bit of my life shown on TV.
Yeah, I mean, there must be some kind of release they have to sign. And do they get a cut of it? Like, is that the draw to like saying like, oh, I tried to bring in a bag of squid to Australia and I had to pay to have it incinerated?
Yeah. So maybe it's like it's reducing down the scale. It's like, well, if it's okay here, then it's okay here, then it's okay here. But particularly like going back a bit. I mean, this whole censorship and what you can consume. I mean, we're a bit more. Maybe one might say open-minded now, because like I remember was it the 80s and the early 90s, Thatcher decided that the IRA couldn't be broadcast on TV, so Gerry Adams had to be voiced over on TV anytime he was talking, and that was like Stephen Ray's gig for about 15 years. He was the voice of Gerry Adams. And they had this great, was it on The Day Today, where Steve Coogan pretends to be one of these guys where he has to like suck down helium so he can't hear his voice normally.
It's fascinating because we were talking about the Brass Eye episode, weren't we? Peter Geffen was called it. Peter Geffen, that's right. And it comes from that kind of lineage, doesn't it, of like Johnathan Swift with his Modest Proposal. The idea that that in order to sort out the Irish famine, that the Irish people should eat their own children as a form of sustenance. And I think in the grand tradition of satire, you've got Brass Eye, and you've got the Gerry Adams with the helium and so on. And I think the thing is that satire works at a particular level, and I think the thing is that it's not immediate and it isn't necessarily easily decoded. And I think the thing is that the people that work in satire demand a certain level of intelligence from the audience. And I think the trouble is with satire is that if people come to it with a kind of comedic sensibility, which is that it's going to be that what you see on the surface is what you get, and it's hardly surprising that people are offended so easily by, I can imagine being offended by the making fun of the, having the IRA as a sort of a comedy point and paedophilia and any of the things that we talk about today. I can understand why people get outraged at it, but satire does work at a particular level that requires a level of intelligence and understanding.
I've actually heard a reverse kind of comment on that recently by all people, Alistair Campbell, so Tony Blair's famous spin merchant who Malcolm Tucker's meant to be based on, but he's got a book he's pushing at the moment about mental health, but he's doing the rounds, and of course people will ask him about the state of the UK, and he one of his points was that we shouldn't be referring to Boris Johnson as Boris. I mean, he's the Prime Minister and he should be referred to as Mr. Johnson or Prime Minister Johnson. Like, he wants to be called Boris. Is in that it makes him more human or makes him more approachable, or like he has to do things that are not good, but it suits his persona to be kind of, Boris.
I think a lot of people have a different name for him, but yeah, it's kind of begins next along in the alphabet, doesn't it?
Our local vicar used a similar trick, actually. So he wasn't Catholic, but he got all of us to call him Father so and so. I won't say the name, and he used that kind of closeness, sort of against some people allegedly, that kind of thing. And it's interesting, like how that false friendship like can be abused, and I mean that whole like Bojo thing really makes my skin crawl. Purely because of like that clownish image that all the papers sort of latched onto. Yeah, it's quite unsettling, isn't it? You're right. It should be Mr. Johnson, because David Cameron was always David Cameron, Theresa May was Theresa May, and now we've just got.
Yeah, but I'm curious to know like how much of that has been controlled from his side for that very reason. Like I know it's kind of, I mean, he was it Lord Mayor for a number of years, and there was the Boris buses, and was there something else, the Boris bikes. So kind of has that kind of a pedigree. So maybe it kind of naturally sit into it.
He's hardly Prince or Madonna. Like, he can't just be known as Boris.
Well, there you go. I'd say if anyone in the English speaking world right now would say Boris, you know probably who that was. So maybe he is.
Interestingly enough, I saw today the trailer for the new Spitting Image.
Okay.
The resurrected Spitting Image, which is coming out on BritBox, and they have a Boris Johnson puppet, and they have a Trump puppet, obviously. And apparently there's been huge outrage because in the trailer we get to see the puppet's genitals. The two of them are showering together or something like that. And apparently that's caused outrage already. I mean, do we need Spitting Image back? I don't know. I mean, these people are sort of, they're cartoon characters already, aren't they?
Yeah, I don't know. There was something of a time. I felt Spitting Image was very punk when it came out.
Yeah.
It was kind of that time. And I just don't know if it will quite have the same edge. I mean, it's a bit like Simpsons, Simpsons, if you go back to Simpsons from 30 years ago and look at it now, it's just like it's such a different voice. I mean, obviously it looks the same, but it's barely comparable in terms of writing.
It's interesting because with the Simpsons, I mean, I love Family Guy, and I think it's 10 times funnier than the Simpsons, if I might make that point. But one of the other things about the Simpsons is that it's the level of xenophobia in it. And I know they were called out with the Indian character in the show, but I mean, it might be because of the American worldview. But I've tuned into it a few times, and I've been quite offended by the sort of lazy racial stereotyping that the Simpsons use. And I think eventually it paid off because they had to remove that character, didn't they?
I felt a bit like I don't disagree, but I actually felt.
Yeah.
I mean, they just had their, I don't know what you call it, their stable of actors, and they asked, could you do voices? And they had this character, and they got this white actor, Hank Azaria, to do this voice, and that's how that started. And then, I mean, I actually think they've said, look, this character, I mean, he has his own shop and he runs it and he works very hard. And then they kind of like Americans of Indian descent or say, look, we felt this was kind of very disrespectful, and Hank Azaria kind of agreed to that. So, and that's fine. They said, look, we're going to replace it. But I actually found that they missed the point that they recently came out and said they're going to bring in actors of color to play the characters of color. And I sort of said, well, that's not the point. Like, it's the lack of the actors of color is the issue. I mean, they could come in and do white voices. They don't have to be necessarily doing the voices of the color that they are. There's like the point is that they're not represented behind the mic, not necessarily in front. And now they're kind of in some way they go out and say we're doing something positive, but they somehow are now actually reinforcing the division that has been.
It's those left wing like that those very left wing sensibilities where it's like a horseshoe. It almost becomes right wing in saying that, like, because you were born here, you're only allowed to play this role. I mean, I'm on a Facebook group for recipes, and I think a white American person had posted something about a recipe they've got for some Thai noodle dish, and they were called out in the comment section for cultural appropriation, for getting the recipe wrong, and for copying someone else's culture. And I was sat there and I was just like, what? So because this person was born in America, they're only allowed to eat hamburgers, and we need clear, divisive lines between what people from different, countries can consume, can wear, because that's almost fascist, saying you were born here, you're only allowed to appreciate this. Where does it stop?
I mean, if you think about cultural appropriation with music, I mean, almost all popular Western music would just have to be destroyed if we didn't have cultural appropriation, because we borrow music from America, America borrows music from us, we get music from Africa. It's just, it is literally just, the old cliche of the melting pot, isn't it? And that's how music works with cultural appropriation. So yeah, I'm not happy with that.
I was surprised to find out that the famous meal chicken tikka masala is Scottish.
Is it really?
It kind of doesn't exist in India like that. It was Indian people who moved to Scotland, but they kind of wound down the flavour to a Scottish palate, and it doesn't really exist. It actually, that's where it has actually started from. And then was it the other one, the chop suey? Chop suey is Chinese for leftover. And apparently in the back of some shop in San Francisco, people would come in for the stuff that was left over at the end of the day. And they asked the Chinese people, what's this called? Chop suey. And then people kept coming in looking for chop suey. Oh, I'd like to have some chop suey. And then this meal was created out of just kind of a mix of everything. So it's kind of, I believe, American. I don't know. It's just kind of, if you want to talk about cultural appropriation, and some of these things kind of have gone around the world a few times.
Yeah, I mean, like the music one and the food one, I will never get. I can understand if it's a big company stealing like a particular country's dress or a particular fashion from a religion, and they're using it to profit, and they're not using it like to praise or appreciate. I mean, like, it should be cultural appreciation, shouldn't it, rather than cultural appropriation? Like, I'm not just saying this because like I'm a white guy who likes Indian food, but like I like to think that I could appreciate a curry just like anyone can, But if it was like a big company owned by a white guy that just stole all these recipes and wasn't doing the right thing and having values as a company, that's where it becomes appropriation in my book.
I've moved around the world a little bit. So I've lived in America and lived in Australia. And in Australia, bizarrely, every single person I seem to hang out with is English. It's just, there's a lot of English people down Bondi Beach for some strange reason. And it's kind of, it's begun to realize like how much we are the same, and how much our culture has become like very smerged over the past 50 years with American TV, British TV. The fact that I could be in Australia talking to an Australian about Brass Eye, which is a UK show, just goes to show you that we were kind of all watching and following the same stuff.
It's like the Neighbours thing. Simon was talking about in another podcast we did recently about the raising in inflection. Was it Neighbours or was it?
Yeah, it was Neighbours. Yeah, in the 80s. Yeah.
That apparently loads of British school kids just copied that Australian raising inflection at the end, and that the echoes of that are still heard. Linguists are still hearing that in the UK.
Oh, I'd say so. Yeah, there was weird phrases I kind of noticed that didn't exist when I left, that I found over there, but by the time I came back 12 years later, they were part of the vernacular here. So, rock up, if you're going to rock up to a barbecue, that was a phrase that only worked in Australia. And then you came back, there'd been so much kind of flow back between the countries that it was common parlance back here too. I'm sure there's loads of little phrases like that.
Oh, I didn't know that was where that even came from.
Yeah, I think the other one I noticed a lot was no worries. It was a big one that they use a lot over there. That kind of seems to have gone everywhere now since then.
I was going to say we were talking about cancel culture and about the idea of just destroying things that we don't like that cause us outrage. I was reading up about this idea that somebody had about, instead of calling out, sort of on Twitter and so on, and trying to stop things, the idea of calling in. So the idea of kind of bridge building, a bit like the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. So instead of cancelling, it's more that idea of opening up a dialogue and saying, well, why do you use that word? Why do you have that attitude? Why do you want to say that? Have you thought about, just making it a more positive thing than the cancel culture that we have.
But I found particularly on Facebook and in the comedy space, there's a very febrile world right now, and it's almost like you try and have a discussion and an argument and say, I see your point of view. I mean, there's been a lot of problems in the sexual abuse of position happening a lot, where bookers are kind of using their position to kind of get favors to get stage time, which is terrible. But I was on a forum trying to discuss this and raise some points about, like, you know, it comes from something bigger. It comes from power. They don't just use sexual assault. They use, you know, blocking people getting stage time somewhere else. But anyway, I was trying to bring up that as a topic. But this person, she was female, said, like, you have never been sexually assaulted. You have no right to discuss this. And it's just like, it was like this pay to play kind of concept. So unless I kind of have diluged my exposure to a problem, my opinion is of no value. And like, I might have endured kind of some experience. I've experienced like a minor bit of kind of I don't know what you call it, racism or bigotry, just by being an immigrant overseas. Not terrible, but you know, a little bit. But I didn't feel like I have to kind of detail out my experiences just so I can have the conversation, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a bizarre thing where you have to like lay down your qualifications of like being a victim to like open that discourse, really.
I mean, that's exactly it. I found, it's like, well, I'm trying to have a positive conversation here, but they didn't kind of want even me to be part of it. I said, okay, well, fine. I found some people have drifted off, and maybe it's just like the echo chamber of the internet kind of promotes that very well. Yeah, so that kind of brings me a little bit to like J.K. Rowling's at the moment. She's kind of got herself a lot of trouble on her views about trans, and she's kind of come out and done a few essays on her position. But it's actually rippled back that people are burning her Harry Potter books, which, I mean, this is kind of the separation of the author from the content. And they kind of say, well, if you kind of go back, and I think like Picasso is kind of viewed as a great artist, but he was a bit of a prick, you know?
I think in a way, it's a generational thing as well, because J.K. Rowling, I think, was she in her 50s?
Yeah, she's in her mid-50s.
And that's right. And I think the idea is, I mean, you know, if you didn't have cancel culture, you'd still have the black and white minstrels on the BBC. So, I mean, the thing is if that didn't exist, you'd still have all the racism and misogyny and comedy that you had in the 70s. So basically, I think cancel culture works in the sense that one generation looks at the previous generation's standards and then changes them. So that's the reason why, you know, we have what we have on TV now is because of that process. And I think it's the same with J.K. Rowling, in that, you know, she represents a particularly privileged and generational view of feminism, and it's one that doesn't, it's inclusive of, you know, trans issues. And what she seems to be unable to do is to assimilate what's going on now with her own views. And I think that's the problem. But whether that means we should stop watching Harry Potter or reading the books is another matter. I mean, people have now started to...
I don't actually remember there being anything transphobic in Harry Potter. I mean, you know, there's they you know, the men even wear dress robes in that. Like I think the Ron Weasley wears dress robes. I just feel like, you know, the separation of art from artist is important. If you don't agree with J.K. Rowling and you don't want to line her pockets any longer, that's fine. But I mean, burning of books, like symbolically, I guess, shows that you dislike what she stands for now. But I feel like that taps into the idea of you fitting in and appearing like, I mean, it's this cliche of being a virtue signaller that it seems like Katie Hopkins is and Piers Morgan's is all seem to love. But there is, I think there is a grain of truth in that, you know, other people can burn their Harry Potter books. That's fine. I don't agree with some of the transphobic things that she's throwing around. I certainly don't agree with this sort of, she's become a figurehead for that kind of viewpoint, and there seems to be like this on Twitter, definitely this group of people that are like, yeah, you go J.K. Rowling, and they're not even fans of hers for any other reason than that she has these views. It's just bizarre to me. I enjoyed Harry Potter as a child.
I think part of the problem is this false dichotomy that Twitter gives us and social media, is that you're either with J.K. Rowling or against her, and you have to decide which side you're on. There's no nuanced sort of position to take. That I agree. I agree with J.K. Rowling wanting equality for women. I agree with her strong feminist views. I disagree with her views about trans people, but that doesn't mean to say that I have to be against her.
But this seems to be like the big problem with cancel culture, is that, and it kind of, I think this sort of comes from, I heard it going all the way back to the sun gods, where you make a peasant a king for a day, and then just so you can throw him into the volcano. It comes even from that, is that we like to raise up people just so we have them on a pedestal so we can tear them down. So if you kind of like, I mean, you guys both seem of a similar vintage, in that you probably remember the days when soccer was just these guys are just footballers. They probably did all right, but they weren't putting down millions or whatever the equivalent of millions was in the 70s. Whereas now they're kind of stupid money. But any of those kind of get caught out. I mean, they get just like ripped down. It seems to be like happening outside of even like it used to be just the pop stars and the sports stars are up on this pedestal. But in the past few years, like people who are like intellectuals who kind of are speaking out that they try and make rock stars. I think Jordan Peterson would be an example of this. That they just wait for like this one thing that they get wrong, and while people might agree with like 95% of what they say there's one wrong thing about this topic. Maybe they misquoted or they mispronounced what they were saying, or maybe they believe it, but it completely invalidates everything else they've said, even though what they have said is actually mostly right. But there's kind of, oh no, you're cancelled now. It's
a lot to do with PR, I think, isn't it? Just the sort of public persona which is so carefully cultivated. So J.K. Rowling's always been like that. These people have always been like that. It's just that they're so their image is so carefully cultivated, it never comes through.
Well, I suppose it's big media and it's big money. It's like everything. If I think it goes back to, was it even the Monkees or something, or the Beatles, that they weren't allowed to say that they had girlfriends just so they could look like they were available, and it was all kind of a controlled image.
But there comes a point where I understand the analogy of someone being put on the pedestal so they can be torn down, but some people go beyond that and it becomes hidden again. I mean, everyone seems to regard Bowie as like, the god of music, just an amazing person. But he's openly admitted in interviews and biographies to sleeping with underage fans. And it's like fame gets to a certain point, it seems, where we choose to ignore it because of a body of work, and it just seems to me to be quite bizarre that bands like the Rolling Stones have also admitted this, and yet their music is still being played. No one's calling them to be cancelled, and someone else could...
I would say yes. It's like with some of this stuff does seem to kind of come back around. I mean, you're just seeing in the UK. I don't know what your view on like all the statues being torn down. So. My experience with English people, a few English friends of mine, is that English people aren't quite taught about the history of what British were doing overseas for 100 years. And you kind of, like, I remember telling my friend about what had happened in Ireland, and that's just one example. The view was that if people in the UK were taught everything that happened in their name 150 years ago, they'd probably go mad. But in some ways, this is coming back. You look at like Charles Rhodes? Anyway, of Rhodesia and Rhodes Scholarship. So I think he has still got some big pile of money that's funding a scholarship even 150 years later in his name. But his statue was torn down because he was definitely an empire builder of the more brutal kind.
Well, even the stuff about Churchill, I mean, I was never taught about the famines in India and how Churchill had diverted food towards the UK even when we didn't necessarily need it during times of rationing. And this absolutely ruined India. We weren't taught about that. I had to seek out that information. I think if it wasn't for my sort of friendship group of, a majority of them being left-wing, Labour supporting, Corbynite, vegan, wilting types, I probably wouldn't have heard that.
But how do you feel then now? Like, if you are one of people in Britain who is kind of pre-educated, who knew about some of this stuff, and then you saw the statues coming down, you was like, what? Why did it take so long? Or is enough time has gone from then to now? Or they did some bad things, they did some good things?
Well, I mean, it's like, what annoyed me was people saying like, "Oh, it's getting rid of our history, isn't it? It's just censoring our history." And I just thought, who gets their history from a statue? You don't look at a statue and just absorb all the information of Churchill's life. I mean, I'd love to live in a time where we could do that in a museum, perhaps, but just, it's still there in the history books. These, Love Thy Neighbour, all these old TV shows are still on DVDs, on VHS cassettes. They haven't been cancelled and all copies destroyed. I mean, if people still want to consume,
they did bring down that famous Fawlty Towers episode.
Oh yes, yeah, with the
Major.
That's right. I was going to say it was the war.
I love Fawlty Towers, and I used it because it was the Germans episode, wasn't it?
I believe it was in the Germans episode. That's why I got confused.
And I used to watch it, and I used to kind of like, I used to kind of gasp at that moment, and it was like, yeah, this is 70s comedy, and yeah, things were different. But that, there was something about that which was so kind of vicious. But then I think that's what Cleese was after. He wanted to show that people could speak like this, that even in the 70s there were people that were still capable of that kind of hate speech.
They absolutely were. I think that's...
And they were just clueless,
I think that's absolutely the point. And that it wasn't that long after, like, the World War II, and a lot of these people were still alive and talking like that, and you may not like the fact that they existed, but it certainly did exist, and this was one of those characters.
Yeah, in that regard, and I mean, it's one episode, one character, but then when you look at a TV show like Love Thy Neighbour, where the crux of the TV show literally just is the attrition between black people and white people, and using that sort of just to get a cheap laugh, like I think that's where the line can be drawn. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we can only really speak about this personally, but I think Love Thy Neighbour is particularly abhorrent. I remember my dad showing me it, and me just think I just didn't find it funny, and he was finding it really, really funny.
Right, but like I also find that just someone who was just like really bad writing, and it's even at the, like, Little Britain kind of got caught up in this, and they're pulling some of that stuff down. And I know some of Little Britain's okay, but some of it's quite poor. And in some ways, I was like, maybe you should be bringing it down just because it's poor writing, or something.
Yeah, I mean, the recurring gag of like I find it really ironic that it's that Matt Lucas is now doing like the Bake Off, because I mean, that sketch where the old white ladies try a delicious cake and then they find out that it's by someone with an ethnic, whatever ethnic means, an ethnic name, has cooked it, and then they throw up. I mean, that seemed to happen
too often
in like most episodes. Yeah, like, okay, we get the idea now.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, but those guys, like the Fast Show, though I don't think the Fast Show suffered as much, but there definitely seemed to be a period of time when comedy shows coming out of the UK were leaning very heavily into the catchphrase and the redo of the catchphrase. And I think Ricky Gervais had that in his TV show Extras, where he inadvertently gets himself his own catchphrase, and has that great scene where he's standing in front of an audience and there's nothing but people with all their different catchphrases and just waiting for him to say it.
Oh, on the t-shirts.
And the t-shirt, yeah, and they had "Am I bothered?" and "I'm a lady," and all these are kind of written all over him. I don't know. It did well in the US, but I don't know if they got that joke. It was a bit too culturally specific, that one.
I mean, I think the Extras is brilliant, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed Dinner Ladies at the time, and then I watched Extras and didn't really get the connection until about a month ago when we were watching we started watching Dinner Ladies, and I just clicked and I was like, oh my gosh, this is what Ricky Gervais is. This was the point of Extras, to condemn this kind of humour. well, not to condemn it, to poke gentle fun at it and sort of say, I'm Ricky Gervais, I'm better than this. I do advanced comedy. This is lower than me.
Yeah. Well, I always find it's more kind of, if you show where the bar is, it's like, that's where the bar is. Be higher. You need to know where lazy is. Try and be better than that.
It reminds me a little bit of what Frankie Boyle said about comedy. He said that you have to be very, very careful when you listen to a joke in terms of identifying the subject of the joke and the target of the joke.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I mean, I guess he said this probably to exonerate himself with his own comedy, but I mean, I think he's brilliant. But I found one of my favourite jokes by. Have you guys heard of Anthony Jeselnik?
I've seen
the
him.
American stand-up.
Yeah, I've seen his name recently.
Yeah.
Got some show going out.
So he tells this joke, right? I dropped my sister's kid the other day. I can't say it was my fault. Who in their right mind would trust me as a pallbearer?
Oh God!
Right. So I mean that's
Yeah.
an Anthony Jeselnik joke. Can you imagine like an hour of stand-up with
It's
jokes
dark.
like that? Yeah. But I mean, if you think about it, the subject of the joke is so appalling, is so dark, it's so awful. But if you think about who the target of the joke is, the target is us. Because the thing is, we expected it to be one thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's 3 sentences in this joke. The first 2 lead us to think that, he's looking after the baby and he's holding it in its arms and he drops it because, men are, supposedly rubbish at kind of looking after babies. And then the final line is the punchline, but we're the target because we didn't expect it. And so we look foolish. Because we thought it was going to be one thing and it turned out to be something else.
Mm-hmm.
Anthony Jeselnik's cleverer than us because he made us think one thing and then he gave us this thing at the end. So we're the target. And I think if you apply that to a lot of comedy that we've talked about today, you can make a case for saying, well, just because of the subject matter doesn't mean to say that, the target of the joke isn't still something that we can appreciate and understand, even if it's just us.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, maybe explains a lot of the very, very dark humour, the humour that causes outrage, and controversy, because it simply is, the subject matter is there as a vehicle. And as we were saying about the brass eye controversy, of course, the subject of it was paedophilia, but the target was the media.
Absolutely.
That's, as you said, that's what Chris Morris was after. And so it doesn't really matter what he chose for the subject. And just like Johnathan Swift, the more extreme the subject of the joke is, the harder the target is hit.
I think it was something had to be quite offensive because it had to hide the other bit. I mean, he was always going up and doing man on the street stuff. And you kind of didn't see it was him because you weren't expecting. And Ali G's kind of work, I think, came very much out of that. Ali G's character was this youth presenter, and he was definitely working off. You're not expecting this guy to be interviewing him. Apparently, like Ali G, Sacha Baron Cohen, in character would come in and set up the cameras and the mics and the chairs and everything, so that. And then only at the very last second would he sit down and start doing the interview. And it was all set up to kind of throw the interviewee off. That's that this guy who's knocking around is just like the help. And then he actually is the interviewer is kind of the absolute kind of gazump on that.
That's interesting because you can sense that the interviewees are ill at ease when he just comes in. I mean, there's some fantastic ones that he does as Borat as well. I mean, you can imagine in the film where he's got the I don't know the actor's name, the big fella who's his
accomplice,
who's his like right hand man. You can definitely imagine him like being behind the camera and like that throwing them off. I mean, didn't he do one with Trump?
Did he? I don't think I've seen that one.
Yeah,
he did. He interviewed Trump.
Him as Ali G with Trump.
That's right.
I have to dig that out because I remember it happening, but I don't know what's in it. That might be a nice one to revisit.
It was a car crash, wasn't it?
Was it really?
Rightly, yeah.
That's surprising, isn't it?
I don't think Trump is self-aware enough to be able for Ali G to kind of take hold.
Now, I was just going to say that I think with our with our podcast, I don't think I think we consciously avoid offence, and I think because we our comedy, I'd say it was it was broad, and I'd say that we try to mix kind of high and low comedy. I think we try to avoid offence, whether it's conscious or unconscious, because I think there's so much comedy to come from kind of other places. But I'm conscious of the fact that we do accents. We play characters sometimes.
Sure.
But I think that in terms of like punching up, I think we're either punching up or we're punching sideways. But I mean, do you think, Sam, that we consciously avoid offence, or do you think that we,
I mean, it's weird because some of our jokes, I mean, we can literally go and do like a fake interview where it's just a list of puns or a list of insults that sound. One time we did an episode where Simon just wrote a list of fake Australian insults and tried in 100 ways to force them into our conversation. We can go from that low level of humour to, talking about issues like we've discussed today, and then having to have to add in. I mean, there was that one time when you did that that sketch about the stand-up comedian, Simon, didn't you?
Nicky Pappalardo.
Nicky Pappalardo.
Absolutely, yeah.
I
mean, I invented.
Could you explain that on here?
I could explain it. Yeah. He's got his own Twitter account, by the way. It's kind of largely dormant, but I created this fake northern comedian who had been very popular in the sort of 70s and 80s, and he'd had a brief kind of flirtation with alternative comedy because Richard Herring and Stuart Lee had written for him his own kind of comedy vehicle in the early 90s. And basically, so he felt that he was a bit kind of hip, but also he kind of still hankered after those huge audiences that he had in the 70s and 80s. And basically, Sam interviewed me as Nicky Pappalardo. And what I decided to do was to take it to a very dark place by having him have a breakdown in the middle of this light-hearted interview where he basically admitted that he'd been abused when he was younger by his uncle. And that basically the conversation that he'd had brought up all these memories and so on. And so by the end of the interview, it had gone from kind of, sort of fairly broad kind of comedy to somewhere quite dark and dramatic. And that's not, we very rarely do that.
I didn't bloody know about it though.
No. No,
I didn't know this was going. So it started off with a joke about going to Oldham, Holdham, and I was thinking, this is quite innocent. And then your catchphrase was, what was it? Hang on, hold on.
Hang on. You're making your own punchlines up there. Hang on. So hang on was the punch, was the catchphrase, and then I managed to work hang on into all these very kind of dark moments, so that by the end he's saying, in your life if things are terrible, you know what you've got to do. You've just got to hang on. So, I mean.
And I at the end of it, I felt so awkward. I felt like I'd actually done an interview with someone that had fallen apart.
Yeah, we don't do that very often, do we?
People.
Yeah, and then I think the next episode I created a character called Rusty Tits, didn't I? So we kind of went back the other way and just had tit jokes for about 10 minutes. So like the New York's tits. The Boston tits, the blue tits. Yeah. Oh yeah, my family. It was it. Yeah, my family. We had so many different branches of my family. And it was just tit jokes. Tits on every branch. But the point is that if you can't mix up, comedy into high and low, you don't get you can't make the points that you want to make. If it's all the same
thing,
palette. And I think
a palette of paint,
Yeah, it is a palette.
Everything should be on the table. I do think I've said this a few times that Bill Hicks, great comic, was one of the worst things to happen to stand up because everyone thought that's how you do it. Everyone thought you need to be that offensive, so they all thought that's how you do comedy. I'm doing it that way, and it's he was good at it, but he knew what he was doing. You don't know what you're doing. go off and learn how to do it properly, and maybe you'll figure out why he was working.
The thing for me is all of the Russells, isn't it? The Russell Howards, all of the Russells, I think Stuart Lee calls them, and they're all kind of like the young men who do, that thing, when you're looking at your phone and you're drunk, and then you dial somebody, and then and it's all that kind of stuff, and it's all that observational comedy where we in the audience feel that we're Russell Howard, and and we laugh along with him. And he can say stuff that's misogynist, and he can say stuff which is offensive, but because he's Russell Howard, and because everyone in the audience is a little Russell Howard clone, everyone's happy, aren't they? And that's, I think, your point, isn't it? That everyone now wants to do this kind of Russell Howard thing. Nobody wants to be Milton Jones. Nobody wants to be Tim Vine. Nobody wants to be Eddie Izzard. But I mean, they're stand up as well. Nobody wants to be Stuart Lee. Even Stuart Lee, I don't think, wants to be Stuart Lee.
Stuart Lee does a fantastic job of dropping in these issues and making fun of it.
Yeah.
Like he includes like sentences that other comedians couldn't say for fear of being deemed offensive. But he's got this really wonderful brand of, I mean, that sketch that he does about, you say you're English these days, and they'll arrest you and they'll have you locked up with the taxi driver, and like how he just takes it into the absurd, and you kind of realize how bizarre the whole situation has become with cancel culture, offense, and so on.
That's been a great conversation, lads. Thanks for coming on. Do you want to say what it is you're working on, how people can find you online?
Well, we are all over the place, really, most of the time. What we basically we're on to season 3 now of our podcast. So we started at the end of March, start of April, and we've already recorded 20 episodes, and they're all on Acast, and they're all on Podbean, they're on
Spotify. They might even be on Audible now.
Yeah, iTunes. So they're all findable, and I mean, basically we've started recording again, and so we kind of do a live cast on Podbean at 4:00 most Sundays. And then that's Sam takes some time to edit it, but we don't do a lot of editing, do we, Sam? We like to keep things kind of in.
Keep it loose. Keep it loose
as much as possible.
I edit out some of the awkward pauses, and I put in CD quality jingles rather than just played through the phone into the mic. But...
Yeah, and but yeah, I mean, we'd love people to listen to it more because. I mean, I think.
And what was the name of that podcast again, Simon?
The Sacred Cow. Yes, and it makes us laugh a lot.
That's about as professional as it gets.
Yeah. And we hope everyone laughs along with it, like we laugh.
Got to work on your marketing skills. You will laugh at this podcast.
Well, I mean, the thing is, we put so much time and effort into it. I mean, literally, sometimes most of like the half an hour before we record it is spent thinking about what we're going to do, isn't it, Sam? At least half an hour, maybe even 40 minutes.
Well, that's the mark of quality right there.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I'm sure some people might enjoy it, but we really just do it for ourselves. And if someone else listens along with us, just having a joke and a laugh, making fun of each other's terrible accents, then that's their fault.
I mean, if you find Ashley Tisdale intrinsically comedic, then you're gonna love our podcast. We find her hilarious. So if you
all right, I'm gonna have to send you back to podcasting school. That's marketing. It's all about marketing. Watch how it's done. You've been listening to Dave Keeshan on the podcast Gurus of Comedy. I'm your host, Dave Keeshan, and you can find us anywhere you can find a podcast. Leave us 5 stars everywhere, and we will see you again. Goodbye.